Welcome, everyone. Dr. Mercola helping you take control of your health. And today we're joined by Naomi Wolf. We're going to talk about her new book and some of her updates since the last time we interviewed her for her old book, which dovetails nicely into the present, which is The End of America. So welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Mercola. I'm a huge fan of what you do, as I hope you know.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. So why don't we go into your new book and tell us why you were motivated to write it? Because that's quite a, it was 2008 was The End of America. Then your new, well, that's quite a stretch, actually. That's over 12, it's about 13 years or 14
right.
years.
Yeah, I wrote The End of America when I saw that issues around terrorism and the terror threat post 9/11 were being used by at that time, the Bush administration in such a way as to hype fear and strip us of our civil liberties. And what I saw when I wrote The End of America was that, I discussed this, was that there are 10 steps to fascism that leaders who want to crush a democracy will always take. And they're the same 10 steps, whether the leaders are on the left or on the right, it really doesn't matter. And so I looked at history and I looked at different times and places in which a robust democracy was crushed. And I saw that, you start with invoking a terrifying internal and external threat. It can be a real threat, but it's hyped. You go on to surveil citizens, you create militia groups unaccountable to the rule of law, you create a gulag, you start to demonize whistleblowers and critics, you start to call dissent treason or espionage or subversion. And then you get to step 10, which is martial law, declaring emergency law. Well, here we are at step 10. And I realized by about June or July of 2020, when we were still under lockdown in New York State, I realized when my governor, Andrew Cuomo here in New York, my then governor, stated that we couldn't have more than 6 people in our homes, which is a massive violation of the Fourth Amendment and the First Amendment, right to assembly, the right to privacy. And I realized that, this had nothing to do with a public health emergency, and that what we were seeing was step 10. We were seeing a wholesale race to exploit what was messaged as a global pandemic in such a way as to strip us of our remaining liberties and to kind of terraform America conceptually into being ready to accept a CCP style World Economic Forum guided post-humane and post constitutional world. And that's only escalated. So I walk the reader through the money flow. I show how bad actors ranging from the World Economic Forum, so much in the news right now, to the Chinese Communist Party, to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and of course, to big tech companies, massaged pandemic policy in various ways to suit their ends. And I show how millions are flowing to big tech companies, especially as a result of completely medically unnecessary pandemic policies. And finally, I explain it, speaking as a tech CEO, which I am now, that what the tech companies especially are driven by is that human beings in human space, having human conversations with human smiles and touch, are a competition that they cannot manage to compete with. And so a lot of the policies that were rolled out as related to a public health emergency really serve to kill off that human advantage and transfer assets to big tech companies.
So regarding your step 10 in the End of America, the implementation of martial law, it seems like we're in a process right now, which is actually taking that to a new level, like step 10A or B, which is the ratification of a World Health Organization treaty, which essentially gives them unbridled privileges of A, declaring an emergency, and then B, having total authority to dictate what every country in the world should do. to me,
exactly.
this is the most outrageous implementation and strategy, and it appears to be well on its way to being approved. So I wonder if you can comment on that.
Yeah, no, nothing is more timely and important, Dr. Mercola. Indeed, that's what's happening. And the fact that Americans have not been able to see this treaty easily, to lobby their representatives, to show up at their Congress people's and senators' offices and to say, not in our name, that's just an example of why these meta-national treaties are so extraordinarily dangerous. And this one in particular, the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, for instance, was a meta-national treaty. A lot of people didn't like it, but it didn't so dramatically essentially dissolve the nation state. Mm-hmm. And this is happening. And I wish people would wake up sooner, honestly. I've been warning people for about 6 months that a war is being waged against us here in the United States. We are at war, even though we think we're not. We don't see bullets flying. This is a new kind of war. And it's a war that the Chinese Communist Party has developed very skillfully. Stalinists developed it skillfully. And we actually train people to do it to other countries at places like School for the Americas. It's never been done to us like this before. But look, Dr. Mercola, and I'll answer your immediate question about the WHO treaty, but look at the big picture. Please, everyone, before I do, our southern border is open. Mm-hmm. Thousands and thousands of people are pouring in.
Hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands. Exactly. Thank you. I'm in favor of legal immigration. I'm the daughter of immigrants. However, what's happening, according to my sources, is that fighting age men from Ukraine and from Afghanistan are pouring in. Millions of dollars in state-of-the-art equipment, night vision goggles, military equipment vanished in Afghanistan. We didn't recover it. Where is it? Who knows? But these are men who are going all over the country, places we don't know. They're not being identified. Their destinations are not identified. They could be being put in place. We're very vulnerable. And then north of us, our historically peaceful neighbor, Canada, their World Economic Forum puppet, Justin Trudeau, declared martial law for about 24 hours when the truckers were protesting in Ontario. And what you saw there was unidentified, very mercenary looking. Were they police? Were they soldiers? Very hard to tell because they weren't identified, which is characteristic of an unaccountable mercenary. And they were very violent toward peaceful, lawful Canadian protesters. You saw the same black-clad, unidentifiable, super fit-looking mercenaries. And the reason I say super fit is that if you look at your local cops, they don't look like highly trained global mercenaries. It's a dramatic physical difference. They don't look like special ops guys, right? Same thing in France when there were protests against the Green Pass. Dramatic violence, shocking scenes by these unidentifiable mercenaries. Well, and then if you look at the emergency, all the pieces are so obvious. President Biden extended emergency law in April. It was the 8th time he extended it. This time he didn't even bother to say it was due to a public health emergency. He said it was due to instability in Iraq. But what that did was it allowed him to flow millions of dollars unaccountably to health and human services. So he's basically weaponizing health and human services all the way down to boards of health, which have been weaponized during the pandemic. And so we are at step 10. This is step 10. Nothing legally prevents right now here in New York State, the governor from doing what she's trying to do, which is create quarantine facilities and have a regulation to drag people off to open-ended quarantine if they're exposed to a bloodborne pathogen. We narrowly defeated a similar regulation proposal in Washington state, but with the World Health Organization treaty, they will have the right, nothing will stop them from having mercenaries that I can't identify show up at the end of my driveway and say, Naomi Wolf, you're a public health threat. And the reason they can do this also is that this messaging is focusing on mental health too. And so if you fold mental health into public health, then you get a rationale to say, oh, dissent is a form of craziness, the way that it's framed in, for instance, communist China. So we are dissolving sovereignty all over the world if the WHO treaty is signed, and it's absolutely terrifying. And we need to wake up and realize that this war is being waged against us. Our nation is literally, traitors are dissolving the boundaries of our.
So I'm sure you're familiar with Matthias Desmet's work, the psychologist professor of psychology out of University of Belgium.
Yeah.
And he's responsible for the concept of mass formation, or at least bringing it to public awareness, primarily through Robert Malone, popularizing it on the 50 million view broadcast that he did with Joe Rogan on New Year's Eve.
Right.
So I had a recent interview with him. I suspect your interview might go up before his, because we're aligning it with the publication of his new book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, I believe.
Yeah.
And it's his thesis that essentially dictatorships can last for centuries if the dictators are benevolent. But totalitarian regimes, and the best examples, of course, we have are Nazi Germany and Russia and with Stalin, tend to invariably self-destruct. So the reason I state that as a premise, it is his contention that this process, that we're rapidly approaching a global totalitarianism, no question. We've never had this before. We've only had it in specific countries. So if it self-destructs, and it seems like this China plan that you referenced for control of DNA and the world population is almost irrelevant, because the whole system's going to collapse before then. I tend to agree with his assessment. So I'm wondering what, you're a really critical thinker in this area. You haven't lost those skills. You haven't been brainwashed by the propaganda like essentially 90% of the United States population. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this.
So the question is, do I agree that totalitarian regimes inevitably self-destruct?
Yes, and if they do, then that really mitigates not mitigates, but dramatically lowers the impact of future projections, because things are going to change so radically.
Oh my gosh. Well, first a shout out to our publisher, Chelsea Green, who I think
yes, my publisher too. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I said our publisher. They're always at the forefront of important work that is too controversial because it's true for mainstream publishers to handle, or legacy publishers, I should say. So I haven't read it yet. I was just given it. But from what you're describing, I gently want to say I don't agree, in the sense that, sure, the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century collapsed eventually. Did they? They collapsed after a world war, and millions of deaths. They collapsed, tens of millions. Thank you. And they collapsed in the case of Russia, with mass famines and deaths in gulags and suppression of liberty for decades and decades. And have they really collapsed? I mean, I see Klaus Schwab as a direct heir to Nazi eugenicists, and Bill and Melinda Gates are carrying on Nazi eugenicist approaches to the human race. These are, the way the WF is trying to manage human beings descends from Nazism. And as I've said elsewhere, and again, I'm the granddaughter of, a woman who lost 9 brothers and sisters to Nazis. So I don't say this lightly, but, and don't take this out of context, but Nazism was too good an idea for it to be killed off in 1945, meaning it was too effective. And we're seeing Nazi approaches to human life, right? The creation of a 2-tier society, vaccinated, unvaccinated, life unworthy of life. I've got a section of my book looking at the history of restrictions, and how always restrictions on assembly, restrictions on commerce, like with Jim Crow laws, or with restrictions on where Native Americans could travel to, how they could trade, those always, or Jews, right, in Vichy France, those always precede theft of assets. And so that's what's happening now to the whole world with lockdowns. All of humanity was restricted in advance of a massive theft of their assets. And that's going to continue unless we resist it. But no, I don't agree that totalitarian regimes, well, first of all, in the 20th century, they collapsed after massive death, starvation, and upheaval and suffering. But second of all, Holy Roman Empire, lasted for 800 years, I believe. And it was pretty totalitarian. The Roman Empire, they crucified people. It was pretty totalitarian living in Palestine, in Jesus's time under the occupation of the Romans. That lasted for centuries and centuries. So sure, if we've got 500 years, or 800 years into the future, maybe the global totalitarianism that's being erected right now will have collapsed. But I don't think we should, relax, because
No, this is not a call to relax. It's
right.
just sort of attempting to project or estimate what's the most likely scenario.
I mean,
So
look, there's
I don't think, I haven't seen anyone who's projecting good times ahead. We're in a lull right now. They've relaxed the mandates and such, and it seems to be more, at least freer, but this is the eye of the hurricane. It's going to get much worse. And
I totally agree with you. May I say one thing
sure,
about
yeah,
the Desmond argument? And again, I feel ashamed because I haven't read it yet, but
the book's not even published yet.
right. But there is another distinguishing factor that we have to take into account with this erection of totalitarianism globally compared with those in the past. And that's the role of artificial intelligence.
Yes.
Which you address. And AI, look, there's AI now has the capability, which I think we saw in the messaging around the COVID pandemic, to tell the same story at the same time around the world at a scale that no human propagandists could ever match.
Mm-hmm.
And AI is like a cat's cradle, so that it can take inputs from India about, how people are receiving a propaganda message and adjust it. Or it can take inputs from people's behavior in real time or the reactions on social media and adjust it. So there's a meta, and people haven't even been informed about the extent to which AI can even tweak existing journalism. So that, for instance, every time you read the word Delta variant, you would see in front of it the words highly transmissible. And every time you saw the word myocarditis, you would see in front of it extremely rare. So that's AI, and that's happening all over the world with all flows of communications, or virtually all flows of communications. So people can be propagandized, and to Desmet's larger point about mental health, they could be hypnotized and lied to,
Mm-hmm.
and an artificial reality could be created for them conceptually at a much more sophisticated level than human beings have ever accomplished, even with Goebbels, even with the greatest propagandists in history.
No, we are in the midst of the greatest propaganda campaign in the history of the world. There's nothing that's exceeded this. And I agree that AI is a big component, and especially it's going to be even huger when we develop artificial general intelligence, which should be well before 2049. But it's the whole broader scope of technology and its influence, which grows almost exponentially every year. And the capabilities, as you're well aware of, as being the tech of a CEO of a tech company. So it's all of that. And I attempted to dialogue with Desmet on this, and he's not really proficient in that area. So we didn't really go too deep in that. But my concern is that with these tools, just as you mentioned, that their capabilities are dramatically, exponentially increased to penetrate compared to the last century. There's no comparison. It's just outrageously expanded. So it gives them the capability to rapidly introduce their attempts, I think, into the population, and we're seeing it. I mean, it's just exploded.
No, I totally agree with you. And a lot of people, understandably, like technology. It's like the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. No disrespect to Catholics. Tech companies and tech CEOs and tech writers have really tried to bamboozle people and make this discourse harder than it needs to be, to keep people in the dark so that they can maintain their hegemony. And the same is true, I think, for data. A big part of my book kind of explains how digital dashboards assemble health data, to show that all these dashboards that this whole pandemic terror were based on, really can't be verified because you can't see the raw data sets.
They're essentially fraudulent, which you magnificently expose.
Well, we don't know because they won't let us see the data sets, right? But if in a tech space, if you can't see the raw data sets, something's wrong, right? Because that's how people in digital technology verify that a dashboard is representing what's really happening, on the back end. So they're probably fraudulent. And I go into detail about how even if it turns out they're not, and they probably are because we can't see the data sets, the way that the numbers have been miscommunicated or lied about to the press, who, took dictation without question, that's essentially a giant set of lies. So for instance, these dashboards would always represent to people a giant number of all the people who had ever been infected ever, and this is like 2 years into the pandemic, without revealing that that's a cumulative total. It includes people who had recovered, which is most everyone. So it's a nonsensical number. And they also would do things like really sneaky, awful things like stop counting over a holiday weekend like Thanksgiving, and then restart again so that the data sets would have stacked up. So it would show a spike. Oh, look, you hugged your grandma at Thanksgiving. Now there's a spike in COVID and it's your fault. Your grandma's going to die. And that just wasn't real. There's also no reason to do it because the counting is automatic. The counting doesn't take human beings. There's no reason to stop it over a holiday weekend. It's not like people are getting tired and have to go home. The machines do the counting. Other things are super questionable and bad, like, in Oregon, they report a COVID case. They define it as cough or a fever, presenting with cough or a fever. So all of those coughs and fevers are feeding into the Oregon data sets. And so my poor mom who lives in Oregon is like, oh my God, I can't go out. And I'm like, Mom, let's look at the numbers. And then it would turn out that like in her county, 8 people presented with cough or fever, and now there's 10 people. And then the local newspaper is reporting it as a 20% spike in COVID cases, right? All kinds of nonsense. But where I was going with that is that people have to become literate about data, and it's not that hard. And they have to become literate about digital technology, and it's not that hard. But I also call for, and this sounds kind of counterintuitive, we've been messaged, Dr. Mercola, for the last 15 years that everything we do as humans in the analog world without high tech is less good than what tech can do. But in many ways, and this is so clear right now at this critical moment in history, what I call the analog humane world has revolutionary capacities that technology can't compete with. And we need to, paradoxically, in this time of crisis, I call on people to reclaim our analog humane world and objects. And what are those? In-person assemblies, you can't hack them. You can't surveil them. A group of people in a living room talking to one another is really hard to hack or infiltrate.
Well, you could if anyone has their cell phone.
Well, exactly. So
this is totally monitored.
Totally. But there are, you're absolutely right. And there are bags that activists I know carry that put the cell phones in. So we're in Russia in 1982, again, but other things like books, physical books, physical libraries, physical bookstores, houses of worship, in-person schools, coins, metal coins, paper money, you can't track them. Combustion engine cars as opposed to electric cars or driverless cars, they can't be tracked as easily. We're really going to have, and I kind of tell people, get off of digital technology and have a humane reality for most of your information. because literally most of the narratives around what COVID was doing were communicated to us by digital technology, by Google, by Facebook, by Twitter, who are deplatforming people like you and me and putting the alarm signals everywhere. If you go here or go there, how clean is it? But if you just count on your own lived experience, the bodies were not stacking up. I'm not saying it was a trivial public health problem, but if we had lived through 1920 to 1922, relying on human life experience, the stories our neighbors were telling us, what we were hearing from our friends, we would have lived through a time in which there was a bad respiratory disease around, but not in which all human activity had to come to a close.
What do we do to prepare? That's the question on the table, because there's going to be a limited time. We don't know when it's going to get worse. I mean, it could be next week, it could be next month, it could be 2 or 3 years. I don't know, but I think it's going to be sooner rather than later.
Well, I do agree with you, Dr. Mercola. Here's my sense of the immediate timeline, and I've been unfortunately right with every projection, since I started making them, since this pandemic began. Mm-hmm. So I just want to tell you timeline, then I want to give you suggestions.
Perfect.
The timeline, it's not good. The November is going to be a very dangerous month in America. These people will stop at nothing, and I'm literally afraid of like a nuclear attack. And I'm
definitely on the table. Definitely on the table.
Exactly. I'm afraid that the war in Ukraine will be the proxy or the rationale for an attack on the homeland, and it'll be blamed on Russia. But it could be like with these transnational entities, it could be anyone.
And it could even be a false flag. They could do it to ourselves.
Well, quite. And I want to tease out a little bit what you just said about a false flag. I think we're kind of even beyond a false flag. And so that's why I've been saying, if you look at the harms in the Pfizer documents that my team has revealed, this is an attack. It's a biological attack. The disruption in our food supplies, I mentioned this earlier, it's an attack. So we are under occupation now. It's not going to happen in the future. We have to notice that we are already under occupation. I used to be a political consultant. Every single thing that the Biden administration has done in terms of messaging and symbolism has served to lower the status of the United States internationally and to demean our symbols. I mean, even little things like checking his watch 3 times at a military funeral, that's not an accident. Those things are highly scripted. And over again, you can see an external hand dialing down the prestige and authority of the United States. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, that did nothing but trash our standing internationally. So point is, we have a captured White House, and that's very dangerous because it means that the FDA may or may not let poisonous food reach our shelves. The FDA turned a blind eye or colluded with unbelievable harms revealed in the Pfizer documents, which I'd love to go into another time on your show. So the FDA can't be trusted. The CDC can't be trusted. So basically the timeline is you can expect more and more disorienting narratives of confusing public events, more and more, it's monkeypox, it's smallpox, it's tuberculosis, to make you feel off kilter and panicked right up until November. In November, I anticipate, I'm sorry to say this, a giant crisis, which will have the effect of it's not safe to leave your homes, everything's radioactive, or it's not safe to leave your homes, there's smallpox everywhere, or there's mass shooters on the loose, it's not safe to leave your homes. And this will drive voters to have to vote by mail instead of in person. And the reason I say this is, as a political consultant, there is no way that these people are acting like they're going to be midterms. They're just not. They're just acting like there's never going to be accountability. There are never going to be investigations. They're never going to be impeached. And so there will be no midterms. So if I were to bet, I would bet that the midterms will be dramatically compromised, if not taken off the table altogether or made cosmetic, cursory. I would imagine that we're going to see more and more gangs. Like what happens right now is militias, and you don't know who they are. So we're going to see more and more gangs wreaking havoc in inner cities or wreaking havoc in businesses, and they'll be called something or other. They'll be called Antifa, they'll be called Proud Boys, but really their job, we don't know who they are. And their job will be to terrorize everyone. I think LA is well along with this, and to create a kind of the complete loosening of social bonds and the civil contract, and lead people to really, like wealthy people in Latin America, a lot of Latin American countries with horrible gang violence, scared to leave their homes, hiring private security and so on. The defunding of the police is directly contributing to this. It's part of this process. And it's worked. Like there are so many cities that are uninhabitable now, in effect, with no civil life because of the defunding of police. So that's going to escalate. And so then we'll kind of be in a world which is a lot like, Sierra Leone after the Civil War, where you're not at war, but you're not safe. And then you have to like pay for protection, or, the cops don't answer calls, or, you're at the mercy of gangs. After that, or along with that, there'll continue to be disruptions in the food supply, certainly disruptions in the energy grid, and probably cyber attacks. So there's going to be parts of the country that are going to be in darkness or unable to communicate intermittently, and that will add to our fear. So all of this is going to play out, and it's going to play out around the world. And they're not going to stop.
This playing out is this year.
I certainly see it ramping up this year, but see, these guys are so clever, and AI is part of this. It's going to ramp up, not like you wake up one morning and, oh my God, the world has changed, but like day after day after day, worse and worse, as it has been. If you told me a year ago, or if I told you that we'd be sitting here talking about the dissolution of sovereignty in America and, no baby food, America, we'd think, oh, that's not possible. So a lot of it will play out this year, but not dramatically enough to elicit an effective counter reaction. And that's their goal. Having said that, there are many things that you can do. And so there's just going to be a degradation around the world, around Eastern Europe, of the right to assembly. Parliaments will be told it's not safe to convene, or you won't be able to see what Parliament is doing. You won't be able to see what Congress is doing. At this point, historically, I hate to say it, elected leaders get death threats. They get the message that it's not safe for them to legislate the way they want to legislate. Historically, there's going to be a 6-month period at some point in the near future in which opposition leaders, civil rights leaders, outspoken journalists and editors will be arrested and taken somewhere. Who knows where they went? And either they'll, appear again like Ai Weiwei, or they won't. And that's the point. And this happened in Germany in 1933. And that's the point at which civil society just shuts down, even without a coup, because everyone's afraid. So I guess that's the way it'll go if we don't stop it. There are many, many things to do if we stop it. And then, and by the way, at that point that there's this much kind of instability, and then of course these mercenaries show up to, reimpose order, but they're not our mercenaries, right? Then there's no more United States.
What's your projection of the probability of that happening?
Well, again, this is like, we're in a time of radical testing of our free will, right?
Absolutely.
It's, if we don't wake up, it's 95% that it's going to go this way.
And along those lines, one of the other things I discussed with Desmond is that 10%, it's only 10% of the people who haven't been brainwashed. There's maybe 60% who are in this quasi period, but 30% are brainwashed. Only 10% of people are awake.
You're right.
It's pretty, and that's a consistent estimation from a wide number of people who are really know this field really well. So it's 10%.
Right.
And you agree with it. I made you the experts that agree with it. So
Oh,
it's a small group of people who are going to be even able to take action.
it is, but I think that the numbers are higher in the United States, and that's due to a lot of hard work of a lot of people in the last year and a half, including you. So I guess what I would say is that there's a robust grassroots resistance to this in the United States. And the Second Amendment is, I can't believe I'm saying this, but the Second Amendment is the key to the US having hope that other countries don't have. So yes, I would say maybe 30 to 35%. There's a huge conservative and libertarian press here that hasn't been propagandized in the same way. And it's weird, right? You'd think the liberal press would be about science and critical thinking, but they're wholly bought off, as I point out, in the bodies of others. So
their communication channels have been impaired. So they're not on YouTube or Twitter
right.
or Facebook, but there's certainly many other platforms that they are available on.
Absolutely, no question. So even though I agree with you that it's a minority who are awake, as you put it, and I was just contacted by a member of the European Parliament who wants to bring the Pfizer findings to the European Parliament because she said, as you're saying, like people really don't know, they're going along with it, they have no idea. I guess, well, first I want to say in America, there is a lot you can do, and even worldwide. This fight is going to only be successful locally and on a state level. And so the things you can do are, I'm learning marksmanship. I hate to say it, but this is where we're at. I'm a peaceful person. I hope no one takes this out of context, but you need to be able to defend your family. You need to be able to hunt. I mean, we are getting to that. Know where your food is coming from, make friends with farmers, create, if you can in the country, or join a CSA with your neighbors. Imagine that you wake up one day and there's no, well, you went through this with Y2K, and there's no electricity and no, digital communications. What will you do? Do you have a plan? I tell people to print out their bank statements and their asset statements because the Great Reset, you should expect that there will be some giant blitz and it'll all vanish. Oh, what do you mean you own this property? No, you don't. And then I would say, at a state level, we can fight this in the United States because Governor DeSantis said, the World Economic Forum, they're not going to enforce it in Florida. The New Hampshire legislature passed a really good bill saying, the federal government can pass, if they pass an unconstitutional law, they're not going to enforce it in New Hampshire. So we have been very successful at Daily Clout, state by state, mobilizing people to lobby their state representatives, but they have to do it fast to pass laws and to show, massive grassroots movement to not enforce the World Economic Forum diktats at the state level. And our founders were such geniuses because they set up our system so that states could do this.
Yeah, the caveat around that, I just did an article, I think that Robert Malone wrote addressing DeSantis in Florida. The threat that the federal government is using is withholding federal tax benefits to the state. So what he was saying is that encouraging the states to stand up, they've got to say no to the federal subsidies to retain their sovereignty.
Right. And so, Dr. Mercola, you're identifying a really important core tenet of what has to be a new movement. And America can be a model for the rest of the world. What I foresee is that there's going to be a movement of institutions and spokespeople that are publicly forswearing CCP money and federal money if it's corrupted, and World Economic Forum money, which is doubtless going to flow. And they'll be open to disclosing their books, disclosing their funders. And the goal now is to create a whole alternative civil society And I've actually just bought a property to start an institute to do that, to invite all the people who are doing that. I hope to invite you as well, to create uncorrupted science, uncorrupted, journalism, uncorrupted medicine, and hopefully we can invite, governors and heads of universities and so on to kind of take the pledge and create uncorrupted American institutions that, that are answerable to the American people, and kind of a new rebirth of anti-globalist corruption. And it's going to take that at the very least.
And it's also a matter of leading by example. I know you describe your journey into having the courage to take some of the actions that you did by using others as role models and inspiring you to action. But then by your actions, you actually are inspiring others. So I think of one area in the book where you implore people to recognize that you're going to have to abandon some long cherished activities or traditions. Like you had to give up I think you moved to a more rural area in New York, and then you found a new synagogue, and they eventually, because of your positions, they eventually told you to leave.
They kicked me out.
They kicked you out. So, which is interesting. So, you basically need to wake up and rethink things and take a look around and do the analysis, because we're in a rapidly changing world.
Indeed. And I feel remiss if I didn't add, totally yes, what you just said. I personally have had to kind of give up, my status as a media darling on the left, and my friends and my networks on the left, when I began to do real reporting on this pandemic and on the mRNA vaccines. And we are in a time where people will have to decide, what am I here for on this planet? And just know that if you cling to lies and you cling to your professional status, your children will live as slaves, and so will you. And it's time to be brave, because if we're a little bit brave now, we don't have to be, horrifically brave in the near future. But on a happier note, I do see that people are creating new alliances, transcending left and right, grassroots uniting to defend our Constitution and our nation. But I do feel I would be remiss if I didn't say to you, and this is hard for me to say because I'm trained, at Yale and Oxford, and I'm not supposed to talk like this, but I also think we're in a massive spiritual moment, that we're in a biblical moment, and that there's a level of metaphysics, over and above the material and the political assault on us and our reaction. And I'm just speaking for myself, but I do feel like this is part of the picture. The nature of the evil that is, unfolded around us so holistically, so quickly, and all these people moving in lockstep, even with AI, and all these people losing free will at once, and all this targeting of, touch and compassion and family and children and babies now, with the research that we've done, the way the mRNA vaccines target the fetus, target the amniotic membrane, target, lactation. This is an evil beyond what Nazis could accomplish, right? This is an evil of a Miltonic scale. And I've looked at it from all sides, and I'm just going to say this, I can't account for it with purely human material processes. It's got an element of sophistication and scale and grandeur that really seems beyond the human to me, and to have an element of the, just massive existential evil. And I'm Jewish, so we don't have a highly developed notion of Satan, but these seem to be malevolent forces that can accomplish things beyond what human beings can accomplish. So as a result, I have started to believe in God in a more literal way than I used to, because these malevolent forces seem to be directed at what is good, what is divine, the human face, which is, my tradition says, an image of God, the human body, which is made in God's image, love, which is a manifestation of the divine, according to many religious traditions. So the family, this is all like, it's like all the things that are being targeted are what is divine about our human journey on this planet. I don't know where to go with that, except that it seems like we're in a moment in which, in addition to all the things we can do, and I'm just speaking for myself, I think we can pray.
Yeah.
You know, like to me, getting out of this, we don't have the ability just as human beings to get out of it. It's too big. But I do believe that getting out of it requires an awakening that's massive. And for myself anyway, asking for divine help, you know, it's worked before.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's a beautiful summary and way to end. And really focusing on the sort of the unintended consequences that these malevolent forces are influencing our culture. All right, well, it's a great book, and I really want to thank you for your perseverance, your commitment, your disciplines, and hanging in there and seeking to educate and catalyze actions to help prevent global tyranny, because I mean, it looks like it's on the table. It clearly is. And it's going to be, we need all the help we can to resist this force to push us into global slavery. So
absolutely. And I'm grateful for you and your team as well, Dr. Mercola. Thank you for your
so the name of the book is The Bodies, plural, of Others, COVID-19 Authoritarians. And there's something after that.
And the War Against the Human.
And the War Against the Human. So, and then of course you've got your website, which is the primary website, the Daily Clout.
dailyclout.io. And you can find me on Getter at Dr. Naomi Wolf.